Donald Trump did not ask Europe to calm a crisis. He told the countries bleeding from Hormuz to build some delayed courage, go to the Strait and take it. In one burst, the war stopped sounding like alliance management and started sounding like Washington trying to dump the hottest part of the fire on everyone else. Europe's cold turn had already begun before Macron sharpened it. Germany's defense minister said it with brutal clarity. This is not our war, and we have not started it. That was the real break in temperature, because it turned polite distance into open refusal. Then Macron torched the whole performance. He said this is not a show, because what is at stake is war, peace, and the lives of men and women. In one line, he stripped Trump's dare of all swagger and left only the recklessness. Underneath it, if you want the layer beneath the headline, subscribe now, because this channel follows the moment the public messaging breaks and real power starts showing its teeth. And tell me in the comments, did Europe reject one reckless demand, or did it just reject Trump's entire war logic in public? Macron did not merely say no. He said, and forcing Hormuz open was unrealistic, because anyone crossing it would be exposed to Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, coastal threats, ballistic missiles, and a stack of other risks. That is why his rebuttal landed so hard. He turned Trump's line from macho rhetoric into an invitation to sail straight into a kill corridor. That is the title fully cashed. Europe turned cold because Trump was not asking for sympathy, consultation, or a shared plan. He was telling allies to absorb the ugliest operational consequence of a war they did not shape. And Macron torched the demand because once you say it plainly, take the Strait is not a strategy. It is a public dare aimed at other people's sailors, other people's ships, and other people's political futures. This is not an argument over a line on a map. Governments are openly discussing how to secure the release of thousands of ships and sailors trapped in the Strait of Hormuz and get shipping moving again. So when Washington says take it, the object is not a slogan. It is a clogged artery full of human beings already caught inside the war's pressure. And this is where the story stops being a debate and starts becoming a moral trap. Because every swaggering sentence about courage eventually lands on people who do not write policy, do not post on social media, and do not get to leave when the mood shifts. They are the ones waiting in steel hulls while presidents improvise. And that is why Europe heard the demand differently. From the way Trump intended it to sound, the scale of the chokehold is already severe. Since March 1st, traffic through the Strait has dropped 94% compared with the same period last year, after a waterway that carried 20% of traded oil. Before, the war was pushed toward paralysis. That means Hormuz is no longer just a military issue. It is now a weapon pressing directly on the global economy. And that is exactly why Europe turned colder than Washington expected. For the White House, Hormuz can still be packaged as a test of nerve, a burden-sharing dispute, or another stage on which to demand loyalty. For Europe, it looks like an energy shock fused to a war it did not start, a supply threat fused to a leadership style it no longer trusts, and a request for obedience, masquerading as courage. Europe remembers what strategic dependence feels like when the bill arrives late and hard. It knows what price spikes do to governments, to domestic politics, to inflation, to public anger, and to every cabinet suddenly forced to explain why it is paying for somebody else escalation. So when Trump says take it, Europe does not hear action. It hears transfer of cost, transfer of risk, and transfer of blame. And Europe is not refusing because it wants to disappear. Britain is sending more missile and air defense systems to Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, and extending the use of Typhoon fighter jets in Qatar. That matters because it kills the lazy accusation that Europe is hiding. Europe is willing to defend. It is refusing to inherit Trump's version of the war. That distinction is everything, and it is where most shallow coverage falls apart. Defensive reinforcement says, we will help stabilize the region, protect partners, and stop spillover. Go take the Strait says something else entirely. Step into the hottest operational zone. make it yours, and carry the consequences if the mission widens into something ugly. Europe is drawing a line between those two worlds. And that line is what the audience clicked for. This is why Macron's answer mattered far beyond France. He was not performing anti-American theater. He was translating a broader European instinct into words sharp enough to survive the pressure of the moment. He was saying out loud what several capitals were already calculating in silence. If Europe accepts this logic once, then every future crisis becomes a system where Washington chooses escalation and Europe gets assigned cleanup. Then Washington made the hidden transaction almost explicit. Marco Rubio said this is not really help for the United States because very little American energy comes through Hormuz, while the world has the greater interest and should step up and deal with it. Europe heard that for what it was, not shared planning, but invoice delivery. The one sentence is the pressure point beneath the entire title. America is telling energy-dependent allies that because they suffer more from the blockage, they should assume more of the operational burden. On paper, that sounds rational. In political reality, it means a war that Washington helped unleash is being converted into a loyalty test for governments that were never given real ownership of the decision that set all this in motion. And once allies hear that clearly enough, they stop feeling like allies and start feeling like instruments. The language changes, a request becomes a shove, a coalition becomes a burden. Sink. A show of unity becomes a mechanism for redistributing danger onto the states least willing to say no in public. Europe's cold turn begins exactly there. At the moment, support starts sounding less like partnership and more like great conscription by rhetoric. The keenest description of this rupture came in one brutal formula. We broke it, but you own it. That is the inversion hanging over Hormuz now. Washington helps ignite the crisis. Iran weaponizes the choke point, and Europe gets pushed toward ownership of the restoration, as if dependency on the oil automatically means dependency on the war plan. That is not burden sharing. Real burden sharing happens before the blast, not after it. Real allies are consulted before the escalation, not publicly challenged after the costs start spreading. And that is what makes this title so potent. Europe is not just cold on Trump's war because it dislikes the tone. It is cold because it can see the architecture underneath the tone, and that architecture treats European exposure as a resource to be used. Here is where the audience's instinct is, right? They clicked because the headline feels like a crack in the Western Front, and that is exactly what this is. Not a collapse, not a divorce, not the end of NATO tomorrow morning, but a visible public rupture in expectation, where Europe has started to say, we do not accept that your escalation automatically becomes our obligation. The White House insists all of this was anticipated. It says Operation Epic Fury was deliberately designed to destroy Iran's navy, missiles, drones, and launch capabilities, precisely so threats to shipping lanes like Hormuz could be neutralized. That is the official confidence line. It tells the public the contingency was understood and the battlefield can still be bent back into order. But wars are full of confident sentences that age badly. Governments always speak in the language of control while they are still trying to prove they have it, because admitting uncertainty weakens deterrence, weakens domestic support, and invites enemies to believe the pressure is working. Europe understands that performance. The problem is that performance becomes very hard to sell when the artery is still constricted. The ships are still trapped, and the demand being pushed on allies sounds simpler than the military reality beneath it. If the route could be taken in one clean move, nobody serious would still be talking about risk, timing, exposure, and post-hostilities arrangements. If the pressure was already solved, there would be no need to publicly shame Europe into absorbing it. That is why Macron's response cut so deep. It forced the conversation back onto the battlefield instead of the stage. It said, in effect, stop treating a corridor covered by missiles and maritime chaos like a prop for macho politics. Europe's official line has actually been more disciplined than Trump's public pressure campaign. The European Union has said the disruption of critical waterways like the Strait of Hormuz must be avoided. That matters because it proves Europe is not defending the closure, not soft on the stakes, and not pretending the problem is imaginary. It is trying to separate reopening the artery from endorsing the method and this authorship of the war. That separation is the core of the cold turn. Europe wants Hormuz open, but not under a formula that converts an American war choice into a European duty. Europe wants maritime security, but not by walking into a trap while active hostilities are still reshaping the battlefield. Europe wants to defend its interests, but not by validating the idea that alliance loyalty means saying yes after the plan is already locked and the costs are already rising. This is what makes the title psychologically satisfying when it lands properly. The audience senses that Macron is doing more than arguing policy. He is refusing humiliation. He is refusing the role Trump is trying to assign Europe, the audience that cheers the show, the cashier that pays for the disruption, and the reserve force that enters when the lead actor wants offload and applause. At the same time, even NATO's language tells you the slogan is detached from the reality. Mark Rutte said allies are working together, discussing how to do that and what the best way to do it would be. Nobody speaking seriously about Hormuz sounds like they believe this is a quick grab mission. They sound like people staring at a problem that can still widen if handled badly. And once that is obvious, Trump's line becomes even more revealing, because it was never just a plan, it was a pressure test. It asked whether Europe still responds to taunts of public shaming and theatrical demands, the way it might have in an earlier era, when the habit of obedience was stronger and the fear of openly resisting Washington was greater. This time, Europe did something different. It did not collapse into line. It did not let the word courage erase the word consequence. It did not pretend there was no difference between protecting allies and being ordered into a live choke point. That is what turns cold means here. Not emotional pettiness. Strategic refusal delivered without apology. Macron took the fight beyond Hormuz when he warned that if you cast doubt on your commitment every day, you erode the very substance of the alliance. That is a devastating sentence because it widens the story from one maritime demand to the structure of trust itself. Europe is not only angry at what Trump asked, it is increasingly alarmed by what his method is doing to alliance credibility. That is the deeper story the viewer came for, whether they knew it consciously or not. The visible argument is about taking a Strait. The hidden argument is about whether America can still assume automatic operational loyalty from Europe after acting first and explaining later. Macron's answer matters because it suggests the answer is no, or at least not anymore, without resistance. Conditions and a much colder political tone than Washington is used to hearing. And once trust becomes the issue, every sentence gets heavier. A demand sounds like a threat. A complaint sounds like extortion. A call for unity sounds like an attempt to socialize the costs of unilateral action. This is how alliances weaken before anyone tears a paper. Not when the treaty disappears, but when the reflex behind it starts dying in public. That is why the information war around this story matters so much. Washington needs the issue framed as burden sharing, because burden sharing sounds fair and morally binding. Europe needs it framed as prudence, because prudence protects it from being cast as weak. Iran needs the pain to travel, because the more the chokehold ricochets through shipping, energy, and allied politics, the more leverage it extracts without winning a conventional battlefield victory. So everyone is speaking, but not on the same level. Washington is speaking in the language of demand. Europe is speaking in the language of conditional distance. Iran is speaking through disruption itself. That mismatch is what makes the crisis feel so unstable. The rhetoric sounds coordinated only if you do not listen too closely. Once you do, you realize each side is describing a different war. Now come back to the title and test it against the evidence. Europe turns cold on Trump's war. Yes, because the refusal is now open to public and tied to real operational lines. Macron tortures his take the Strait demand. Yes, because Macron did not answer the line with diplomacy, speak. He answered it by reducing it to what it really was: unrealistic, dangerous, and unserious. in the face of missiles, maritime exposure, and trapped shipping. If Trump meant the demand literally, then Europe's response exposed a limit on American coercive leadership it did not want visible. A US president can still bark, still pressure, still shame, but he can no longer assume major European powers. Will automatically convert that into obedient military ownership. The old reflex is weaker than Washington wants to admit, and Macron just proved it in public. If Trump did not mean it literally, if the whole line was pressure theater, the damage is still real, because Europe heard the message anyway. It heard that when Washington gets in trouble, alliance language can suddenly become transactional, improvisational, and public. It heard that support may be praised in abstract terms, but extracted in forms that suit American frustration rather than shared strategy. Either way, the conclusion survives. The Take the Strait demand did not just create a spat, it exposed the collapse of an old assumption, that America can choose escalation and Europe will quietly handle this stuff. Aftermath. Macron's real offense was not that he mocked the line, it was that he said no in a way other capitals could live with, understand, and use. That is why this story is bigger than a French rebuke. Berlin had already hardened. London chose defensive reinforcement, not blind entry. Brussels held its line on waterways, law, and de-escalation. NATO spoke in a language of deliberation, not swagger. Paris then took all that silent skepticism and gave it a face, a voice, and an edge sharp enough to wound. The chill was already there. Macron just made it visible. And remember the people inside the steel hulls, because they are the human anchor this whole argument tries to erase. Thousands of ships and sailors are still trapped in the artery, while governments negotiate, posture, and calculate. They are the final proof that this is not a show. When leaders start treating strategic chaos like a test of masculinity, it is always other people who end up waiting in the crosshairs. So here is the hard answer to the central question. Europe did not merely reject one reckless phrase. It rejected the hidden logic inside it, the logic that says Washington can light the match, Iran can close the artery, and Europe can be ordered to prove its loyalty by stepping into the fire. That is why the response was cold. That is why Macron's pushback felt so sharp. And that is why the headline matters more than it first appears. The Strait is not the only thing under pressure now. Automatic alliance trust is under pressure too, and once that pressure hardens into memory, Washington will discover something far more uncomfortable than one angry French president. It can still demand, but it can no longer assume the Old West will march. Stay close, because this channel follows the fractures after the slogans fade, and the next truth usually shows up where official unity sounds loudest.